Hi there, everyone. Welcome. This is I'm Ardon Toonstra from FHIR, and I will be the moderator today for this session. And please post all your questions that you want to ask Gino in the Q&A section on Wova, and we will make sure those got answered. So for now, please, Gino, you can take it away and share your screen if you want.
Sounds good. Oops. And of course that fails there. Give me 1 second.
It's all right.
Okay, it's just yelling at me about your screen sharing, and there. Should be able to see everything now.
Yes, we do. Nice.
Outstanding. Well, hello and welcome to FHIR Subscriptions. My name is Gino Canessa. I will be your tour guide for this little corner of the specification here today. A little minutia before we get started. The deck should be available in Wova. If not, it's also at this short URL here, aka.ms/devdaysgino. That does have old decks. In case you're interested, I leave them there and just replace with the newer ones. So if you're interested in history, you can see them there. I'm also supposed to introduce myself. So I am a senior software engineer with Microsoft. I work on health standards and interoperability out of the beautiful Madison, Wisconsin office. So hopefully when we're all in person, someday there will be something out this way. With that, subscriptions. Why do we even need to talk about subscriptions? And oops. That is because REST has a polling problem. Normally in FHIR, we're talking about REST, GET, POST, all these things. But if you need to know when something new has come in, if you're interested, if you're a patient and you're interested on your device of knowing about new medications, new encounters, anything like that, the only way you can find that out is by repeatedly asking the server. And that's not good. It's not good for the server, who has to be constantly fielding these queries from many, many clients. It's not good for the client. If you're on your phone, you don't want it constantly having an app running that's waking up just to ask the server if there's something new. But there's a lot of lag time if you don't do that frequently, and it's not a great thing. So what we really want to do is ask the server to tell me when the data changes, right? We want to say, this is what I'm interested in. Just let me know when it happens. And that way I don't have to keep asking periodically as a client for when this happens. Problem solved. We're done. We have subscriptions and we're out. Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy. So this is just a brief history. I won't spend too much time here, but I do like to show so that people are aware of where we're coming from. Subscriptions were actually added all the way back in DSTU2 time. So this was identified very early on as a use case that people needed to know about or needed to handle. But it's had kind of an odd history. During the DSTU2 times, people figured out that sometimes what you're interested in is a context change. So that actually split off into a project called Firecast. And I mentioned these two projects in case they're more what you're trying to solve, in which case there's a lot of content for them. And CDS Hooks has sessions here, Firecast doesn't. But Firecast is interested in context changes. So that the kind of canonical example they use is a radiologist that's sitting in front of a workstation, has the EHR, EMR, the record system open, has their medical viewer, their DICOM viewer open, and has their transcription dictation system open. If I change patients in any of those apps, all of the rest of them need to know about that. So it's real-time communication that's happening on things that may have resources, may not have resources. And so that's, Firecast took that and has grown, and they just had another release recently. And there's lots of content there. So if that's what you're interested in, that's what you're looking for. Another one that kind of split off is called CDS Hooks. That's short for Clinical Decision Support Hooks. And that one is for the use case of saying, I have a practitioner who is doing something in a user interface, and I need to know that they're doing that thing. And that way I can inject other things and do this kind of closed loop. So one of the common examples there is if I'm going to prescribe a medication, I want to see the medication interactions that I need to be aware of. So while I'm on a screen as a practitioner, the system needs to be notified that I'm doing this, and then it can go do those things and bring me back to where I started. Again, there may or may not be actual resources in a server. There may not even be a server involved. And so that split off into CDS hooks. And Dennis Patterson is hosting a session on that this week. So all of that was happening kind of between DSTU2 and STU3, so that by the time we got to R4, everyone said, oh, let's really look at what's remaining. And unfortunately, it wasn't quite right. And we'll get into that in a minute. But we started a subscription rework. So we said, push the big red button. We're fine with all breaking changes. Let's reconsider everything and build it from the ground up. We've landed pretty well on what we think will exist in R5. There's one block of changes left here, but R5 keeps getting pushed out. So then we've backported everything into R4, in particular R4B, since we had to add a couple of new resources. Again, without spending too much time, in R2 to R4, it was result sets. That's how subscriptions work. So basically, a client would give a server any arbitrary query and say, let me know whenever this set of results changes. It sounds great in theory, and that's why it was a great starting point. But it turns out it has a lot of issues with scale. When you start dealing with millions of records and thousands of clients at a time, having servers keep track of all of that and be performant is pretty complicated. And there's also a lot of other pieces that go into it, that it's kind of a hit or miss. There's some use cases that it works very well for, and other use cases which it just can't be used at all. So implementation lagged because it wasn't working for a lot of the use cases that it was needed for. So for R5, the biggest change was moving from that kind of result set idea and concept into a topic-based concept. If you're familiar with PubSub, WebSub, I think even RSS feeds use this kind of style to say, here's a topic that I'm going to subscribe to, and then I can filter it if I need to, but it narrows the scope for servers. So to do that, we had to make a new resource, and that resource is kind of covering this conceptual event. So, you know, if you're doing a patient admission, if you're doing a new medication, if you're looking for any sort of resource change, anything like that, great. That's one topic. During this redesign, we also had to add some flexibility to subscriptions, and in particular things around channels and payloads that we'll dig into more in a little bit here. And then changes to the notifications themselves. So make it more consistent across the different channel types, make it more clear what's coming across, better error detection, things like that. So again, as I mentioned earlier, R5 keeps slipping a little bit. And so we have the R4 backport IG. The first version of this was just going to be on top of stock R4. But we found that we could add the new resources to R4B, and that made it much less painful to implement. So R4B is supposed to be published, hopefully now in the spring. And so, as I mentioned here, all the functionality, half the weight. So hopefully in the spring, we'll be able to have that all published, and everyone can start with production implementations and not worry about anything changing out from underneath them. Since R4B has the two new resources, those are easy to implement. And then we put extensions on subscription because we can't actually make any changes to that resource in R4B. Same thing, we're using a history bundle instead of the new bundle we made because we can't add a new bundle type. That would be a pretty breaking change. So what is a subscription now? As I mentioned, the first part is this topic. And this is where I was saying you might, there's a lot of links throughout here. So I'm not going to cover where they all are, but they point to build.fire.org for R5 things and R4 backport IG and everything else. So if you want those, you'll want to grab a copy of the deck instead of trying to type them all out. But a topic is going to define what causes the notification. So as I said earlier, we had a few examples of patient admission, things like that. So it's just saying, this is the data and change of interest I'm interested in. It's also going to define what filters are allowed. So in the case of, for instance, the patient admission, you'll want to filter on patients and things like that, and we'll get into deeper into some examples. That leaves the subscription resource. It's really, I think of it kind of as a configuration thing. It's what you're using to link a topic to an actual client. So you're saying, this is the topic I'm interested in. Here are the actual filters that I want to filter on. Here's my endpoints, all of those things. So it's kind of that bridging piece between them. And then notifications themselves, which are bundles, and they include a subscription status so that you can kind of figure out what's going on, plus potentially payloads. So the subscription topic resource, which we had to name that way since topic is just a little too general, it's a canonical resource. If you're not familiar, canonical resources are definitional resources. So it's things that are saying kind of more conceptual things or how you do things instead of a concrete. You know, if you have a patient resource, that's derived from a domain resource, which is saying this is a thing. This is a medication, this is a device, this is a whatever. Whereas a canonical is saying kind of, here is a way of doing things, here is a concept of things. The nice thing is that once R4B is released, we can actually keep these in the FHIR registry. And that way we can get broad adoption on individual topics. So again, saying things like patient admission, that's something that everyone's going to need. There might need to be changes. So we have steps on how you derive from them, what things you can change, what things you can't change to kind of work with client expectations. But we'll be able to have a single patient admission topic that everyone in the world could derive from so that it's much easier to discover and interoperate. The key is obviously to describe what causes a notification. So we've tried to set this up to be as flexible as possible. There's human readable text, which we'll want to contain the description on what you want to do. And then there's different computable definitions. So there's query-based, there's FHIR path-based, there's FHIR interaction-based, things like that. So you can say, computably, here's how you would implement it, and then the text description for a person reading it saying, this is what we are trying to do. And as I mentioned earlier, it also defines the allowed filters. And this is really key for implementations on the server, so that when you say, for instance, again, going back to patient admission, you don't try and do things like saying, well, I want to know about patients who have a given condition, who are past a certain age, have received a certain medication, and have been previously admitted for this same condition. That's a very complex query that a server is not going to be able to do performantly for notifications. And so the topic lets you say, well, you can go on patient ID and that's it. I can implement that very easily. I can hook it up to my existing HL7 v2 message pump and I'm done. So some examples, and again, I've been kind of touching on this one since it's our most common one that we use in discussion, but patient admission. It's just a topic that's kind of keyed off the encounter resource, and we're looking for a specific status, which is in progress. And then we might allow a filter on patient ID. So you can say, you know, as a consumer and a patient, I am this patient and I want to filter on that. Or you might define it on patient groups. So this is common for care teams, this is common for payers, things like that, that you say, here's a group of patients and I want to be notified on anything that happens in that group. Just to grab another example, this one I said, you know, a new explanation of benefit. So you would just, same thing, be looking at a different resource. So the EOB resource, you might want that just on the create interaction, just anytime one's created, and then have different filters for that based on, excuse me, exactly what you want to filter for. So we can see this is going into the details here. And again, I tried not to just dump the whole resource here because there's a lot of fields that aren't too interesting. But really, we're just keying off the encounter resource. Our description is just, a beginning of a clinical encounter. That's all we're trying to capture. It's a pretty straightforward concept that doesn't need a lot of description. And then we can see we have our two computable definitions that I've included here. So the first one is in FHIR. And when you're doing FHIR, we said that the incoming resource has the %previous variable and the %current variable to show before and after the change happened. And so we're just looking for ones that the previous status is not in progress, and the current one is in progress. Pretty straightforward for FHIR, so that's a great example for that. And then we have one that's using queries. And queries, same thing. We said, well, we'll actually expose two different state queries so that you can run the previous and current, since you can't chain them like you can in FHIR. And what we're looking at is the previous one has status not in progress. And I line things up. Obviously, you wouldn't put all these spaces normally, but the current one is status in progress. Since we can't chain them like we can in FHIR with ands and ors and everything, we have an option here requiring both, true or false. So that's the same thing of doing and or here. And then we have this additional kind of odd thing, and we have one for result for create and one for result for delete, which is whether you want the test to pass or fail. So in our case, for instance, if we are creating a new record and the status is already in progress, well, the previous status we can't evaluate because it didn't exist. And so this is the way of saying, well, in our case, anything that's created and matches the current, we want it to pass. Whereas if you're looking for a specific state change to say, I want to know when it went from, canceled to in progress, then you would say create is false because I'm not interested in ones that were created in this state. I'm looking for that state change. The other piece I wanted to dive into on the topics is this, the can filter bys that we've been talking about. So you can see there's, again, documentation describing what we're trying to do. In this case, we have a search param name because encounter has a search parameter called patient, and we're going to allow an equality or an in modifier. And those are described there. The equals is kind of stretching the idea behind a search modifier because it's really just that there's no modifier for matching it. But we're still finalizing the exact language we'll use for some of those. So now we have a topic, we can go into a subscription. And again, this is a domain resource, so kind of a regular resource that you think about like a patient or an encounter or observation. And this is just going to be used to link a topic to a request. To that end, we need endpoint information. That's one of the biggest things. We need to know how we're sending this information from the server to the client, and then where we're sending it to in that channel. And we'll jump into those here in a moment. We need the format of the notifications. So things like the MIME type, how much information we're including. I think those are kind of the biggest two that we need. And then setting your actual filters. So in our topic, we said we can filter on patient ID. The subscription is the one that says, well, here's the ID we're filtering on. So the channel types, as I was mentioning, it's just a method of communication. So we in the standard, again, FHIR tries to cover the 80% rule. So we're going to define things that 80% of people would find useful. And so we went ahead and defined, what is this, 4 channel types. REST hooks, which are the standard HTTPS, hopefully, just a web notification, web sockets, especially for clients that need to connect and can't expose a REST URL, email, which is actually very popular in public health and things like that, that aren't going to have a server endpoint up and listening all the time. They just send me a notification to this email address. And then FHIR messaging, which is to say if you're already using the FHIR messaging paradigm, trying to layer one of these other channel types on top of it is pretty awkward. One of the big changes we made for R5 is to make this extensible. So before you had what we defined and that was it. Now we said, oh, you might have other things to do. Hopefully there are things like I have a message queue that I'm using. I have a specific cloud vendor that I want to integrate with, and I'm going to use that format. Unfortunately, one of the first ones we've seen is fax. And everyone can bother Graham Grieve about that, that he is actually going to be defining the fax channel type because he has a use case that requires it. Along with the channel types are the payload types. And so this is kind of the way of playing with performance versus privacy, security, whichever way you want to phrase that spectrum. And so we start up here with the pings. So this is an empty payload. It gives the least information, but it's going to require the client to query. So basically, we're going to tell the client something happened on this subscription, and the client's going to have to say, okay, well, what happened? There's obviously very, very little to no risk of PHI leaking because there's none in there. So that's kind of the there. But then the server is going to have to go and reevaluate all those queries. We'll actually jump down to the last one here, which is the full resource, because that makes the most sense to do next. And that is to say the notification actually includes all of the resources. So if you have the encounter, here is the encounter. You want to make sure you're using a secure channel to do it. But in that case, you know, all the PHI, all the information you need is there. And so the client doesn't have to come back to the query or to the server, hopefully at all. In the middle, we have this include identifiers or ID only method. And that's to say that the notifications will actually include the IDs of the resources, but not the resources themselves. So this is kind of that middle ground to say, I'm going to send you the encounter ID, perhaps the patient ID, maybe observation IDs, whatever I want in my notification. So you can just come, authenticate, and retrieve them, but you're not going to perform any of these expensive queries to figure out what's happening. So again, here's the kind of more detailed differences for the straight comparison between them. So step one is always the notification. And so we can see kind of the differences in what gets sent in the notification. So the ping has just the notification with a subscription ID. The ID only has the ID and the IDs of the resources. And then the full resource has the subscription information, the IDs of the resources, and the resources. And so it makes a difference in how the clients interact with that notification. In the case of a ping, well, I'm going to have to query the server and then retrieve data. In the case of an ID only, and my cursor disappeared, there we go. In the case of an ID only, I can just retrieve it. In the case of the full resource, I don't have to do anything. I have everything I'm interested in. So in practice, what do some of these look like? So if you were doing a patient admission one from a consumer, we would want a REST hook because we have some sort of endpoint that's listening that's just out on the internet. I'll note this is common in particular because it might be a relay. So in the case of an app on a mobile phone, realistically, you want a push notification to the phone using the platform that the person has signed up on. And so you're going to have something that's receiving HTTPS and then converting that into what you actually want to go to the phone. And that's in part because we're not going to ask FHIR servers to start implementing, oh, here's your iOS push notification, here's your Android push notification, and actually expect servers to be doing all of those things. In this case, again, we're going to have a single patient filter. We're going to do ID only so that we're limiting how much PHI goes, especially given that this could be a relay. We want to make sure that we're not sending resources through it because hopefully they're well behaved, but we can't guarantee they're well behaved. We're going to set, actually we're going to set FHIR plus JSON and go from there. And just as a counterpoint, I wanted to show, like, if you were doing a medication dispensed for a practitioner. So if you're saying you're working in a provider in a facility and you want someone to be able to connect and know that every time a medication is dispensed in their ward. Well, in that case, you would probably want a WebSocket connection. You know, if they're doing this from their cart, their tablet, whatever that is, they probably can't expose an HTTP server. So this way with a WebSocket, they can connect in. You would want to filter, for instance, on location so that you can say, I'm just interested in this floor, this ward, this building, whatever it is. And since this is all internal, you can just do full resource, and that way the actual notifications give you all the information that you're interested in, which medication it was, how much, you know, the dosage, all that kind of information could be there. So same thing, just to drill into a few actual fields. We can see the first thing is we're linking to that canonical topic. And I purposely used example.org here to say there's going to be something, it's not likely going to be defined on that server. You know, they'll have a copy of it most likely, but the canonical URL is the one that where it actually lives and where it's defined. We specify our channel type, our endpoints, the content type, what type of content we want, and then our filters. So we're saying we're filtering encounters based on the patient, and we want the value of patient 123. So once you do that, what do you get? You're going to get a notification bundle. In R5, we have a fancy subscription notification bundle type, but in R4 we don't, so you get a history bundle. That was kind of the one that had the closest alignment on the requirements. There's a bunch of invariants on different types of bundles about which fields you can populate or not. And so after a lot of back and forth, we landed on history. You'll get some status information. So the first entry of that bundle is always going to be a subscription status resource. And that's important because that tells you which subscription it is. It tells you the event number that you're on, so that you can tell if you've been missing events, things like that. So that's always going to be the first entry of that bundle. And then there'll be additional entries depending on your payload. So if you have an empty payload, you'll just get your subscription status. Whereas if you have full resources, then you'll have those included as well. So if you want to develop, test, or play, we have a reference implementation that we leave up. And again, this is one of those link-heavy slides, and I know the text is a little small on it, but I'll cover anything that's too interesting. These are all open source implementations. It's a server, which is actually just a proxy that sits in front of another server. There's this client UI, which is a TypeScript app, which you can use to actually interact with it. And then there's this client host that kind of acts as an intermediary for putting up public URLs to listen on when you need it. They're all available online. You can just click through and play with them. I'll note that the UI is actually doing all the FHIR operations in TypeScript on the UI. So you can point it, for instance, to localhost and interact with a local server and things like that. We do have an R4 and an R5 endpoint. I will note that right now it is R4, not R4B, but that will hopefully be changing in the next week or two so that we can have that up and running. All of the server-side stuff is in C#, and that's all in TypeScript. There's also a tab on there and a set of projects for DevDays examples, and these have been going for a while now. And these are just kind of the minimum projects in C# or JavaScript Node to do a complete REST workflow. So, you know, bring up a server, send a request, get the notification, and kind of close that loop. And in honor of worldwide WWDC that's going on right now, I couldn't resist. But we do have one block of changes for both the R5 and the R4 versions that we know about and are in the process of implementing. Right now, this is an active Argonaut project, and we're doing that jointly with FHIR as an experiment for the accelerator this time. So we have calls every other Wednesday. Everyone is welcome to join. They are listed in the HL7 calendar under FHIR subscriptions, and they're also listed on the Argonaut project calendar as subscriptions. We are planning a track for the September Connectathon. We've had at least since Connectathon 19, I think, there's been a subscriptions track. But the one in September is going to be pretty critical for us because this will be the last chance for any feedback to make it into the R4B backport. And it's getting pretty close to the last chance for the R5 stuff. So if it's something you're interested in, something you want to have feedback on, please make sure you test. And like I said, the reference server is up all the time, so you can always test against that and give feedback on Zulip or anything else. But the Connectathon will be pretty critical because that will be the last chance for those changes to make it in. So with that, hopefully, I'd forgotten to start my clock, so hopefully we're pretty close on time. Here's a page full of links for, again, people using the deck because I wouldn't type all of these in. But again, the short link where this deck is, R5, we have a nice subscriptions overview page that talks about all the different resources and everything. The R4 backport IG, the reference implementation, and then the Argonaut subscriptions project home. So I haven't seen any questions in there, but at this point, if anyone has any questions that they'd like to type or unmute and ask, I will open up for that.
Nice, Gino. I think you gave a very clear presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question, but I also see there is another question that just popped up.
Okay.
Multiple, actually.
There we go. So let's see. They're slowly trickling in on my version. So will there be any standards recommendations offered for security for how a FHIR server will authenticate to the subscription endpoint? Yes. This is one of our open discussions that we're kind of really trying to focus on this year in particular. We have some guidance already, particularly around things like use HTTPS instead of HTTP or WSS instead of WS, things like that. One of the kind of front runners, I'll say, for REST is using the smart backend services authentication, which was initially added in the bulk data implementation guide. And they're actually, I believe, moving that over into the smart implementation guide so that it's more discoverable and easier to link to. So we do try to stay on top of that. And then we also link to the security and privacy work group. And they've done some work back and forth. We've gone back and forth with them a couple of times. So hopefully that answers, and I can type more. Perfect. Let's see, the next one. We have a need to notify our consumers when a bulk FHIR job has completed so they can return to download the associated files. Currently, they must poll. Seems like a good fit. Is anyone working on that specifically? I don't know that anyone's working on that specifically, but that does tie into the set of changes that we're working on right now. And that's actually a fantastic use case because one of the other examples we had is for doing content exchange within Firecast, and you want to subscribe to a Firecast event. And that doesn't have a resource change or anything like that. It's just an event that I want to include a subscription for. And so I will add this use case, but the short answer is that right now the models work, although it's a slight stretch on some of them because you can define it without a resource and still, as long as you describe the change, you're kind of fine. But we're trying to make that more of a first level type of use case so that we don't have to stretch anything to do it. Let's see, the next one, will all resources be supported for subscription? Yes. Well, I'll say yes in that subscription will work on any resource. What a server implements is going to be up to that server. So one of the things is obviously regulatory, regulation driven, things like gaps in patient care and care team notifications and things like that. Those are likely to be implemented first, especially by the large vendors, and this framework will work for those. Will they implement, generic topics on some of these other things? Probably not at the outset, especially for a FHIR server. That's very difficult to say, here's an arbitrary FHIR query that I want to be notified on. And so I expect there'll be more and more implemented, and there'll be more servers that are offering kind of the generic queries. But one of the best things will be to get those topics defined so that we can get them included in the registry and kind of start pushing out adoption. And that seems to drive a lot of people as well. Let's see, is there an EHR sandbox offering subscription service? I don't know of any sandbox today other than the reference implementation. And so that I'll just bring up quickly here to show. You can come in here to the subscriptions.argo.run if you're just looking for testing. And you can see we have R4, R5, we have all of the different endpoints we're using, everything else. And hopefully we can connect. The beauty of doing all these things live. There's walkthroughs for what we do as kind of the Connectathon scenarios that we usually use. And then there's like the playground. So we can just say, for instance, here's the list of subscription topics. We can create a REST endpoint. We can, let's see, we want to search for a patient whose name, where is name? Name includes test. And we have lots of patients with that. I'll just pick one at random. I usually like testemic test face, but I didn't see them. So we have kind of these, you can see the endpoint interactions, subscription interactions. We'll add the filter and create the subscription. And there's WebSockets and all these other things as well. And then you can even send encounters so that we get notifications, which should show up here. Yes. So there's the actual notification bundle. And this is using the history bundle because it was using R4 and it was before we had things in R4B. Like I said, this I hope to have fully updated before next week. So if that's what you're asking for, that's there. And if not, I don't know if anyone else has any in production yet. Let's see, continuing down the list. Would subscriptions be the appropriate, would subscription be the appropriate implementation to use of one-on-ones be notified when a doctor submits an order for a patient? Yeah, that's one of the goals, is to be able to handle things like that. So if a practitioner wants to submit a particular order, then putting that into your workflow, that's exactly it. Instead of polling to see, is there a new order, is there a new order, we want to say, well, the server can tell you that there was a new order and then send you that information. So yes, that's a very good use case. Let's see, the next one, will complex stateful subscriptions be supported? For instance, will we be able to create a topic that fires on readmissions or potentially adverse effect prescription additions? You should be able to. There's, if it doesn't work, then we're not really doing our job. So the idea, and let me switch over to a web page again. So this is the subscriptions framework page that I was talking about. But if we look at the subscription topic, we can see, and that's a lot of these things are going to disappear. We were using the definition pattern because that's what we were supposed to use when it was defined. Now when we inherit from canonical resource, all of these things disappear, a lot of these extra fields, because they're just inherited. But you can set up triggers using very complex statements in order to do all these things with chaining and everything else. And that should all be very straightforward to do, so that you can do things like saying, when the status was this and it created this, or when there's a new resource that has a new encounter for a patient that had this type of encounter and things like that. All of that should be describable beyond just plain text. But even if it's super complicated to actually computably define, as long as there's a topic with that plain text, a server can implement it however they want to implement it, and then as long as that topic is discoverable, then that's usable. So that is supposed to be in there as well, yes. And I think that catches me up on questions, or if any of them need additional information, please feel free to ask. And I'll type these in for the people that ask questions. I'll go ahead and type answers there at some point as well. So, but I think I've been keeping up.
Yeah,
Arden, do you see any I missed?
No, I think you've answered them all.
Oh, outstanding.
We're 5 minutes before time, so that's also very nice.
There we go.
Maybe I also have a very generic question.
Please.
Do you know of any other standards or public standards that do something with subscription and notifications? And if so, what do we learn from those?
Yes, so definitely a lot of the things we've learned from things like web sub, pub sub, and that's people refer to it differently depending on when they started interacting with it. A lot of that is where we were trying to pull from, which is to say, those are kind of the generic mechanisms that people have used to solve this on the internet. Those are, I don't remember if they're W3 standards or I think they're owned by W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. And so there's been a lot of work, a lot of effort put into them. And so we're kind of trying to take that type of model and say, how would you make that work best in FHIR? And so trying to pick up from all of those, we have a lot of implementation experience and a lot of time. I personally have been working on this. It's not been my only project, but it's been one of my projects for over 2 years now. And so there's a lot of people who've been putting a lot of time into testing these things, building these things, trying different models, and seeing what we can do so that we end up with something very, hopefully, when it's all published and released, very flexible and covers all of the use cases.
Nice, thanks. And
yeah,
maybe one last other question.
Sure.
Can you tell me any of your experience with regards to the connectathons you've already done for subscription resource? How many people are there?
Oh yeah, we've had, like I said, I think there's been a subscriptions track since Connectathon 19, every Connectathon, so that's 3 times a year. We've had everything from some of the large EHR vendors that they have test servers, because obviously it's not in production servers, but they bring test servers that have both the R4 and the R5 implementations done. Those seem to work well. We've seen clients. It's been a lot of fun to see kind of what people can come up with clients, because we have things like Python scripts that just kind of dump information onto a page so that you can get a readout of patients that are coming through your facility or things like that, just to play with and test. We've seen people using low-code solutions for triggering, HTML posts and then receiving HTML notifications back. And we've had pretty good participation from the US, from Europe, and not this Connectathon, but the one previously from India. We've had very good participation as well. So we're trying to make sure it's very international and pretty flexible. But yeah, overall, it seems to address all the use cases we've had, and that pending the set of changes we have here. Some of those open discussions on better security. One of them is on graphs of resources. The Da Vinci group and payers in particular are very keen on getting not just the encounter, but the encounter, the patient, the observations, everything in one bundle. And that's supported today, but it's not well defined how you would actually do it. And so those are kind of some of the open things that we're trying to just finally nail down.
Nice. Well, we're also almost about time. So
yes,
I think it's time to wrap up. So thank you very much, Gino. I think it was a very nice presentation.
Thank you. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm around pretty much all the time. So on Zulip, on email, on however else you get a hold of me, I am happy to discuss. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ardon in particular.
Great. See you in the next sessions.
Thanks. Cheers.